Rachel, just describe, if you will, what you witnessed transpire here this afternoon.
David, we were taken up to the 13th floor to enter that courtroom. I was part of a small group of initially 20 people, members of the public, as well as reporters, who were allowed to enter the courtroom for such a historic arraignment of the former president. Before the arraignment actually began, former President Donald Trump seated at that defense table, at times appearing restless. He was twiddling his thumbs, his hands were crossed, his shoulders slunched over, his mood stern, at times stoic, but it was clear that he was ready to move forward and to move forward quickly. Walt Nauta, the co-defendant in this case, sitting just 2 chairs over. Trump did not utter a word throughout this entire proceeding, but he didn't necessarily have to. He appeared restless. Jack Smith, the special counsel, sitting just on the other side of the former president in the first row, at times glancing toward him. The former president, from my view, never looked back. The judge asked at the beginning of this if Trump's 2 attorneys were there permanently or temporarily. We know that the former president has been meeting with new attorneys after 2 of his attorneys resigned just hours before that indictment was unsealed. Jack Smith glancing back at Trump at times, and his lawyer, especially when his lawyer said most certainly Trump pleads not guilty. Of course, the tension, as I'm sure many of our reporters have told you, came in the courtroom around who exactly Trump should have contact with. The judge laid out at first that Trump should have no contact with witnesses unless through counsel, no contact with the co-defendant in this case, but emphasizing that since Walt Nauta works for the former president, that he would only allow that to be contact about the facts of this case directly. Now, Trump's lawyers did make a very forceful argument inside, saying that that would be impossible because many of the witnesses or victims in this case could potentially be a lot of people that work for the former president. As we know, a lot of these classified documents were found at his Mar-a-Lago resort, in the bathroom, in the ballroom, in storage rooms. It was clear at one point that the former president was eager for this to end. When the bond was brought over for former President Donald Trump to sign it, he pulled a pen out of his jacket, signed it very quickly, his lawyers pouring through it. Well, turns out they skipped a couple of pages. That bond actually had to be brought back to that defense table 3 times, so much so that the judge remarked, "3rd time's the charm." And then, of course, Walt Nauta not necessarily having a permanent legal defense team there today, and so he will not be arraigned for another 2 weeks. You know, David, sitting inside of that courtroom for such a historic arraignment today, I will tell you I was just struck by the number of Secret Service in the room, so much so that the first 2 rows behind the former president were completely empty. I was struck by the president's mood. Again, at times, his arms crossed for most of this arraignment. He leaned forward, he leaned back, only glancing at the prosecutors occasionally, but for the most part, his eyes were staring forward straight at the judge. And when his arms weren't crossed, he was hunched over the table. Shoulders were slumped. And David, of course, as we are covering this unprecedented arraignment, one thing that certainly sticks out here is the fact that the judge said the words former president before the criminal defendant's name. And of course, in this case, that is Donald Trump.
Rachel Scott, just emerging from that courtroom, we're watching the motorcade now leave federal court in South Florida. That motorcade beginning the journey back to the Northeast tonight, where the president plans to hold a rally. We suspect he will immediately begin to take aim at this investigation, and certainly the charges that he entered a not guilty plea to through his attorney, Mr. Blanche, a short time ago. Excellent reporting from Rachel Scott, and dare I say it shows that we were on the right track in our conversation up here, because even she described the confusion in that courtroom, the challenge, the initial challenge anyway, if you will, the federal magistrate asking that the former president have no contact with any witnesses in this case except through counsel. And then there was the back and forth, the asking for clarification. The judge did clarify with reference to the case. So that doesn't preclude him from talking to witnesses about, say, other things like a race for the president, the White House, but does preclude him, at least for now, until they can, reconsider perhaps under Aileen Cannon when she takes the case from here. But at least for now, there appears to be in place some guardrails here for the former president, being told that he's not to have contact with witnesses in this case, about this case, unless it's through counsel. Rachel reporting out, and I thought this was pretty interesting because Rachel was sequestered, if you will, because she was inside that courtroom, could not leave until everyone left. And much of her color bears out with what our other reporters were offering to us from the overflow room, that this was a president who wanted this over with, this hearing over with. She talked about his shoulders being hunched over. Interestingly, and Rachel, if you can still hear me, I think this is interesting for our audience. Jack Smith, the special counsel, obviously in that courtroom. We weren't sure if that would happen today. Pierre suspected it would, and he did appear. You did not notice any. You saw Jack Smith looking at the former president, but you didn't see the former president looking back to him.
No, look, Jack Smith's presence was certainly known in that courtroom. Our eyes caught him, in fact, before we actually caught the former president sitting at the defense table. And while Jack Smith glared at the former president through much of this, the former president never once turned around. I did not spot him looking back at Jack Smith. The former president was allowed to exit first, and then Jack Smith and the prosecutors followed, David.
We know there's two federal prosecutors standing just before Jack Smith making the case before the federal magistrate judge. Did you see any contact between Smith and members of his team who took on the roles, at least in this initial hearing?
Towards the end, we definitely did. In the beginning, before this arraignment actually began, Jack Smith was just seated in the first row, his eyes just staring forward. It wasn't until it started getting underway that we started seeing him look at the former president. And then at the end, when the judge allowed everyone to leave, that's when we did see Jack Smith walk out of the room with the other prosecutors and then speak to his team.
Rachel, the former president's demeanor as he left that courtroom?
Stoic, stern. He quickly rose up. He was allowed to exit through a side door. And there was one moment, David, as he was walking out of the room in which he turned back and looked at the members of the press as well as the public that had been seated there. Didn't say anything, didn't utter a word throughout the entire proceeding. He exited, but again, his demeanor, his body language, how stern he was, how restless he was at times, said everything about how the former president feels about today. He wanted to get this over with quickly, and he seemed pretty irritated that he had to come here for this appearance today, David.
And Rachel, one of the other sort of pieces of color that came from the room was the wait in the beginning, that the president was seated for a time, waiting, we were told, up to 10 minutes or so for the federal magistrate judge to enter the courtroom. And we took note of that, too, because obviously as the former president, you become accustomed to not waiting for much, particularly when the stakes are this high. I don't know if you were in the courtroom at that point and you witnessed that as well.
Yes, David, so I was in the courtroom likely for probably about 7 or 8 minutes before the arraignment actually did begin. And I did notice this is when Trump did appear the most restless. He sat with his arms crossed. At times he was sort of swaying. This is when I saw him cross his hands sitting on the desk, at times fiddling with his thumb or moving his hand behind his ear at one point. He was looking around to see when exactly this would begin, and we were wondering what the delay was as well. Obviously, there was so much security, Secret Service in the federal courthouse behind me. It took a while for members of the press, for members of the public to get in that room and to be seated. We all had to be screened before going in. So that is likely probably some of the reason for that delay. But the former president, again, was sitting there for a period of time waiting for this to begin. And something that you just mentioned, David, this is the former president of the United States. Things typically start when he wants them to start. He's never commanded to rise as he was in the courtroom today, to sit through and listen to everything that the judge was saying, the back and forth between his defense team and the prosecutors. And you could tell that he was ready for this to be over with. He was ready to move on, ready to enter that not guilty plea and get out of the room.
Hi, everyone. George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel. And don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.